The crack of a pistol shot sliced through the stale air of Los Alamos, New Mexico territory, as Emmeline Parker dropped to her knees, clutching the letter that would forever change her life. It was 1878, and the telegram trembled in her hands, its message as clear as it was devastating. Her brother had accrued a debt of $1,200 to Vernon Hollister, the most feared man in the county, and payment was due in full by month's end, or there would be consequences. The modest ranch house that had been her home for 23 years suddenly felt like a prison. Their parents had been gone 3 years now, victims of a frontier fever that had swept through the territory. Since then, it had been just Emmeline and her brother Daniel, struggling to maintain the small cattle operation their father had built. Daniel, barely 20, had always been reckless, but gambling away more money than they could earn in 2 years was beyond anything she had imagined possible. Emmeline's brown eyes stared unseeing at the wooden floor, her auburn hair tumbling from its pins as she considered their options. The ranch was mortgaged to its limit. The cattle herd was down to 30 head after the drought. There was nothing of value left to sell and no relatives to turn to for help. "Miss Parker," a voice called from outside, followed by a heavy knock. "Miss Parker, I've a message from Mr. Hollister." Emmeline composed herself quickly, tucking the telegram into her pocket and smoothing her simple cotton dress before opening the door. Martin Wade, Hollister's right-hand man, stood on her porch, his lean frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. "Mr. Wade," she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Mr. Hollister wanted me to remind you about your brother's situation." His thin lips curled into what might have been a smile on a kinder face. "He's willing to be reasonable given the circumstances." "I need more time," Emmeline said, her mind racing. "The cattle won't fetch enough," Wade finished for her. "We both know that, but Mr. Hollister is offering a solution." He paused, and something in his expression made Emmeline's skin crawl. "The Gilded Horseshoe needs a new girl. Pays good for someone who can serve drinks, sing a little, keep the customers happy." "I'm not that kind of woman," Emmeline replied immediately, her cheeks burning with indignation. Wade shrugged. "Who said anything about that? It's honest work serving drinks, but it pays well, especially the tips. You could clear your brother's debt in 6 months, maybe less if you're friendly." The implication hung in the air between them. "Mr. Hollister wants an answer by tomorrow noon." After Wade left, Emmeline sank into her father's old rocking chair on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mesas with gold and crimson. The Gilded Horseshoe was Los Alamos' most notorious saloon, a place respectable women never entered. Working there would mean the end of any proper social standing she had in town. But what choice did she have? Daniel was being held in Santa Fe until the debt was settled, and Hollister's men had made it clear what would happen if payment wasn't made. The next morning dawned bright and merciless. Emmeline had packed a small valise with her meager possessions: 2 dresses, her mother's cameo brooch, a hairbrush, and a dog-eared copy of Pride and Prejudice. She left a note for the Wilsons next door, asking them to look after the ranch, then climbed onto the buckboard wagon and set out for town. Los Alamos was a growing settlement, caught between its Spanish colonial past and an American future. The railroad had come through 2 years earlier, bringing new prosperity and new troubles alike. Main Street bustled with commerce. A general store, the telegraph office, a hotel, 2 competing banks, and at the far end, standing apart like a temple to vice, the Gilded Horseshoe Saloon. Emmeline tethered her horse outside Hollister's office, a tidy building adjacent to the bank he owned. The sign on the door read, "Vernon Hollister and Associates Banking," investments, and territorial development. It was a respectable facade for a man who controlled most of the gambling and half the vice in the county. "Come in, Miss Parker," Hollister called when she knocked. He was a large man in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with a diamond stickpin in his silk cravat and silver at his temples. "I've been expecting you, Mr. Hollister," she acknowledged, remaining standing even when he gestured to a chair. "I understand you've made an offer regarding my brother's debt." Hollister smiled, revealing gold-capped teeth. Direct and dignified, I like that in a woman. He opened a ledger on his desk. "Your brother owes me $1,200, plus interest accruing daily, a considerable sum." "I'm aware of the amount," Emmeline said. "I'm prepared to work at your establishment to pay it off." "Are you indeed?" Hollister leaned back in his chair. "And what skills do you bring to my establishment, Miss Parker? Can you sing, dance, deal cards?" "I can learn whatever is required," she replied stiffly. "As long as it's respectable work." Hollister laughed, a sound like rocks in a tin can. "My dear, the Horseshoe is a business, not a charity. I need workers who bring in profits." He studied her for a long moment. "But you're a pretty thing, refined, different from the usual girls. That has value too." He scribbled something in his ledger. "You'll start tonight, $6 a week plus tips. Half of everything you earn goes against your brother's debt, and I'll stop the interest clock as a gesture of goodwill." Emmeline did the calculation quickly. Even with tips, it would take months to clear the debt. "And my brother stays where he is until the debt is paid," Hollister said flatly, "but I'll see he's treated well. I want to see him. All in good time, Miss Parker, all in good time." Hollister closed his ledger with finality. "Report to Madame Rosalie at the Horseshoe at 4. She'll get you settled." The Gilded Horseshoe was relatively quiet when Emmeline arrived that afternoon. Just a few early drinkers hunched over glasses of whiskey. The saloon was more opulent than she had expected: crystal chandeliers, red velvet curtains, a long mahogany bar, and a small stage where a piano player idly tapped out a melancholy tune. A massive gilt-framed mirror dominated the wall behind the bar, reflecting the room in slightly warped dimensions. "You the new girl?" A tall, elegantly dressed woman in her 40s approached, appraising Emmeline with shrewd eyes. Her French accent was slight but noticeable. "I am Madame Rosalie. Mr. Hollister said to expect you." "Emmeline Parker," she introduced herself, fighting the urge to turn and flee. "Follow me," Madame Rosalie instructed, leading her through a side door into a small but tidy room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe. "You live here now, safer that way. The girls who go home get trouble." "I have a ranch to look after," Emmeline protested. "Not anymore, you don't," Rosalie replied bluntly. "Not until your brother's debt is paid." She opened the wardrobe, revealing several brightly colored dresses. "These will fit you well enough for now. Blue one tonight, I think. Brings out your eyes. These are." Emmeline touched the satin fabric of a low-cut gown, her face flushing. "Suitable for work," Rosalie finished for her. "You serve drinks, you smile, you listen to men talk. Maybe you sing a little if you can carry a tune, nothing more unless you want to." Her expression softened slightly. "I know what you're thinking, but this is not that kind of house. Mr. Hollister runs a gambling hall, not a brothel, though what the girls do on their own time," she shrugged, "that's between them and their conscience." The blue dress was more revealing than anything Emmeline had ever worn, but still modest compared to the attire of the other 3 saloon girls she met that evening. Sadie was a buxom blonde with a raucous laugh. Violet was a quiet brunette who dealt cards with remarkable dexterity. And Pearl was a worldly redhead who had, she proudly declared, worked every saloon from St. Louis to Santa Fe. "You'll do fine, honey," Pearl assured Emmeline as they prepared for the evening rush. "Just keep smiling, don't let the customers paw at you, and if anyone gets fresh, signal Big Tom." She nodded toward the burly bartender polishing glasses. "He'll handle it." That first night passed in a blur of noise, smoke, and unfamiliar faces. Emmeline served drinks, deflected propositions with as much grace as she could muster, and tried to ignore the stares and whispers from men who recognized her as the Parker girl from out by Cottonwood Creek. By midnight, her feet ached, her cheeks hurt from forced smiling, and her pride lay in tatters around her like discarded playing cards. But her pocket held $15 in tips, more money than she'd ever earned in a single day. "Not bad for a first night," Rosalie commented when Emmeline turned over her earnings, half of which would go toward Daniel's debt. "You have a natural dignity that intrigues them. Use it, but don't lose it." Days stretched into weeks. Emmeline developed a routine, rising late, helping clean the saloon in the afternoons, working until the small hours, then falling into exhausted sleep. She learned to serve drinks without spilling them, to deflect unwanted advances with a witty remark instead of a slap, and even to sing a passable rendition of "Beautiful Dreamer" when called upon. She wrote to Daniel weekly, though his replies were infrequent and contained little news of his situation. She worried constantly about the ranch, though the Wilsons sent word that all was well. And she counted every dollar that went toward clearing the debt, watching the total slowly, painfully diminish. It was a month into her employment when Preston Phillips rode into Los Alamos. The town had been buzzing about his arrival for days, the wealthy cattle baron from Wyoming, looking to expand his operations into New Mexico territory. Rumor had it he'd already bought the old Sanchez property east of town and was negotiating for more land. Emmeline first saw him when he entered the Horseshoe on a Tuesday evening. The normal rowdy atmosphere quieted momentarily as he crossed the threshold. He was tall, broad-shouldered but lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His clothes were quality but practical, no flashy Eastern dandyism, just the well-worn gear of a man who worked alongside his cowhands. "That's him," Pearl whispered excitedly. "The Wyoming man. They say he's worth $50,000 and owns land in 3 territories." "He looks like he could use a drink," Rosalie observed pragmatically. "Emmeline, see to it." Gathering her courage, Emmeline approached his table. "Good evening, sir. What can I bring you?" Preston Phillips looked up, and something in his steady gaze made Emmeline feel as though he was seeing past the blue satin dress to the woman she'd been before. "Whiskey," he said simply. "The good kind, if Mr. Hollister keeps any behind that fancy bar of his. We have Jameson's Irish, sir." "Will that suit?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "It will indeed, Miss Parker," she supplied. "Emmeline Parker. Miss Parker." He nodded, his manner courteous but reserved. When she returned with his drink, he thanked her politely but didn't engage in conversation. Instead, he sat quietly, observing the room with the watchful eyes of a man accustomed to assessing situations and people. Emmeline found herself glancing his way throughout the evening, noting how he nursed a single whiskey, declined offers of company from the other girls, and departed early without participating in any of the gambling. "Not much of a big spender, your cattle baron," Sadie remarked when he'd gone. "A man like that doesn't need to flash his money around," Pearl replied sagely. "He's not trying to impress anyone." The next evening, Preston Phillips returned, taking the same corner table. Again, Emmeline served him, and again, he was polite but distant. This pattern continued for several nights until Friday, when the saloon was packed with miners who'd just been paid, cowboys blowing off steam, and the usual assortment of gamblers and drifters. Emmeline was delivering a tray of drinks to a rowdy table when one of the miners grabbed her wrist. "Sit down and have a drink with us, pretty lady," he slurred. "Thank you, but I'm working," Emmeline replied, trying to extract herself from his grip. "Come on now, don't be unfriendly," another miner chimed in, his hand settling on her waist. "We got money to spend." "Please let go," Emmeline said firmly, looking around for Big Tom, who was busy breaking up another dispute at the far end of the bar. "I believe the lady asked you to release her." The voice was quiet but carried an undercurrent of steel. Preston Phillips stood behind her, his expression calm but resolute. The miner scowled. "Mind your own business, Cowboy. We're just being friendly." "Being friendly doesn't require holding someone against their will," Phillips replied evenly. "Now let the lady go and we'll forget this happened." For a tense moment, Emmeline thought the miner might argue further, but something in Phillips's steady gaze must have convinced him otherwise. He released her wrist with a muttered curse. "Thank you, Mr. Phillips," Emmeline said quietly as they moved away from the table. "No need for thanks." He guided her toward the bar with a light touch at her elbow. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. It happens sometimes." She attempted a smile. "Part of the job, I suppose," his brow furrowed. "It shouldn't be." He looked at her curiously. "If you don't mind my saying so, Miss Parker, you don't seem. That is, you don't appear to be the saloon girl type," Emmeline finished for him, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "No, Mr. Phillips, 6 months ago I was managing my family's ranch. Life takes unexpected turns sometimes." Something in his expression shifted, surprise, perhaps, or respect. "I understand unexpected turns," he said softly. "My condolences for whatever circumstances brought you here." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted near the card tables. One player was accusing another of cheating, and chairs scraped back as men prepared for a fight. Big Tom moved quickly to intervene, but not before one man drew his pistol. "Get down!" Phillips reacted instantly, pulling Emmeline behind the shelter of the bar as a shot cracked through the air. The bullet shattered a bottle on the shelf, sending glass and whiskey spraying. Women screamed, men ducked or drew their own weapons, and within seconds the saloon teetered on the edge of chaos. Phillips kept a protective arm around Emmeline as they crouched behind the bar. His body was warm and solid against hers, his heartbeat steady despite the danger. Emmeline found herself acutely aware of his closeness, the clean scent of him, leather and soap and open air, so different from the tobacco and whiskey that permeated the saloon. The standoff ended as quickly as it had begun when Marshal Jenkins entered, his shotgun commanding immediate attention. The offending parties were disarmed and escorted out, while Rosalie efficiently directed the cleanup and restoration of order. "Are you hurt?" Phillips asked Emmeline when they finally stood. "No, I'm fine." She brushed glass fragments from her skirt, suddenly self-conscious under his concerned gaze. "Thank you for your quick thinking." "Just instinct," he replied modestly. "I've been in a few saloon disputes before." "On which side?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. A genuine smile transformed his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Usually the peacemaking side, Miss Parker. I find that bullets tend to damage profitable business relationships." The rest of the evening passed without incident, though the excitement had thinned the crowd somewhat. Phillips remained at his usual table, but Emmeline noticed he seemed more attentive to her movements around the saloon, his eyes following her with quiet watchfulness. When closing time came, he was among the last to leave. As Emmeline collected empty glasses from nearby tables, he approached her. "Miss Parker, I wonder if I might speak with you tomorrow on a matter of business." Emmeline paused, surprised. "Business, Mr. Phillips?" "Yes," he hesitated. I understand from town gossip that your family owns a ranch near Cottonwood Creek. Her guard immediately rose. The ranch isn't for sale if that's your interest. Actually, I was hoping to discuss a different arrangement. He glanced around at the emptying saloon, perhaps somewhere less. Public curiosity overcame caution. I'm free tomorrow afternoon before my shift begins. We could meet at the hotel cafe at 2 if that suits you. It does, thank you. He tipped his hat politely. Good night, Miss Parker. After he left, Pearl sidled up to Emmeline, eyes dancing with mischief. Well, well, looks like you've caught the cattle king's eye. It's a business discussion, Emmeline insisted, though she couldn't quite suppress the flutter of anticipation in her stomach. Pearl just smiled knowingly. Honey, in my experience, when a man like that looks at a woman the way he was looking at you, business is just the beginning. Emmeline lay awake longer than usual that night, her mind racing with questions. What could Preston Phillips possibly want to discuss? Was it truly about the ranch? And why did the prospect of seeing him again, away from the noisy saloon, make her heart beat faster? The hotel cafe was nearly empty when Emmeline arrived the next day, dressed in her most respectable day dress, a high-necked navy blue cotton that had been one of her mother's final sewing projects. She'd taken extra care with her appearance, pinning her hair in a modest but flattering style and wearing her mother's cameo brooch. Preston Phillips was already there, standing when she entered. Up close and in daylight, she could better appreciate the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting in the sun, the strong jaw covered with a neatly trimmed beard, and the capable hands that now held a chair for her. "Thank you for coming, Miss Parker," he said as they settled at a corner table. "I took the liberty of ordering coffee." "That's very kind." Emmeline folded her hands in her lap, determined to maintain her composure despite her curiosity. "You mentioned business regarding my family's ranch." Phillips nodded, his expression serious. "I've been in Los Alamos for nearly 2 weeks now, assessing potential properties for expansion. During that time, I've heard various stories about your situation." Emmeline stiffened. "Gossip travels quickly in small towns." "It does indeed," he agreed. "Though in this case, I made it my business to learn more. I understand your brother incurred a substantial debt to Vernon Hollister, and you're working at the saloon to pay it off." "That's correct," Emmeline acknowledged, her cheeks burning with shame despite her effort to appear matter-of-fact. Daniel was unwise in his dealings. The debt stands at just over $1,000 now. Phillips took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "Miss Parker, I've had several business dealings with Hollister since my arrival. While investigating a property he's offered for sale, I discovered some irregularities in his accounting practices." "What sort of irregularities?" Emmeline asked, her pulse quickening. "The kind that suggest he may not be an entirely honest businessman." Phillips leaned forward slightly. "I believe there's a strong possibility that your brother's debt may have been artificially inflated." Emmeline's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Hollister cheated my brother?" "I'm suggesting it's worth investigating," Phillips replied carefully. "With your permission, I'd like to look into the matter more thoroughly. If what I suspect is true, your obligation could be significantly reduced, perhaps even eliminated entirely." Hope flared briefly in Emmeline's chest before caution dampened it. "Why would you do this, Mr. Phillips?" "We're strangers to you." For the first time, Phillips seemed somewhat uncomfortable. He cleared his throat before answering. "Let's just say I have a particular dislike for men who use their power to take advantage of others, especially when those others include young women forced into unsuitable circumstances." "I see." Emmeline studied him, trying to discern his true motives, And what would you expect in return for this assistance? Nothing, he said simply. Though I will admit that if the Hollister situation is resolved satisfactorily, I would be interested in discussing a potential business partnership regarding your ranch. Strictly on fair terms, of course. Emmeline weighed his words carefully. Everything she'd observed about Preston Phillips suggested he was an honorable man, but she'd learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. Still, what did she have to lose? Very well, Mr. Phillips, she finally said. You have my permission to investigate. But I want to be clear, I won't be trading one obligation for another. Whatever the outcome with Mr. Hollister, any business discussions about my ranch will be conducted as equals. A smile of genuine admiration spread across his face. I wouldn't have it any other way, Miss Parker. He extended his hand across the table. Partners? She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm, his skin calloused from honest work. Partners, Mr. Phillips. Preston, he corrected gently. If we're to be partners in this endeavor, I think we can dispense with formalities. Emmeline, then, she replied, finding herself returning his smile. Their coffee grew cold as Preston outlined his plans. He had already arranged to review Hollister's bank records under the pretext of a larger business deal. He had connections with the territorial marshal's office, who could be called upon if evidence of fraud was found. And he had the financial resources to settle Daniel's legitimate debts immediately, should that prove necessary. It may take a week or two to gather what we need, Preston explained. In the meantime, it would be best if you continued your work at the saloon as usual. We don't want Hollister becoming suspicious. I understand, Emmeline agreed, though the thought of returning to the Gilded Horseshoe now that a possible escape was in sight filled her with fresh dread. What about my brother? He's being held in Santa Fe until the debt is paid. I'll send a trusted associate to check on his condition, Preston assured her. If there's any hint that he's being mistreated, we'll take immediate action. As they parted ways outside the cafe, Preston hesitated. Emmeline, I want you to have this. He pressed a small Derringer pistol into her hand. Just in case. The saloon can be a dangerous place, as we saw last night. The weapon was lady's size, pearl-handled and elegant despite its deadly purpose. I can't accept this, Emmeline protested. Please, Preston insisted. For my peace of mind, if nothing else. His expression grew somber. I don't trust Hollister or his men if they suspect we're investigating. Understanding the unspoken warning, Emmeline reluctantly slipped the Derringer into her handbag. Thank you, she said quietly. For everything you're doing. Don't thank me yet, Preston cautioned. We've a long way to go. But his eyes held a promise that gave Emmeline the first real hope she'd felt in months. True to his word, Preston made daily appearances at the Gilded Horseshoe over the next week, maintaining the pretense of being just another customer while skillfully gathering information. He charmed the other saloon girls, played moderate stakes poker with the regulars, and gradually worked his way into Hollister's confidence through discussions of various business ventures. Emmeline, meanwhile, found her work at the saloon increasingly difficult to bear. Now that escape seemed possible, each night of serving drinks and deflecting unwanted attentions felt like an eternity. Yet she played her part carefully, giving no indication that anything had changed. Only in brief, private moments, a quiet exchange when she brought Preston his customary whiskey, a meaningful glance across the crowded room, once even a stolen conversation in the deserted storeroom, did they acknowledge their shared purpose. It was during one such moment, 10 days after their cafe meeting, that Preston murmured the words Emmeline had been waiting to hear. I've found it. Proof of Hollister's fraud. Not just with your brother's debt, but with dozens of others. Relief washed through her like a flash flood. What happens now? I've telegraphed Marshal Carter in Santa Fe. He'll be here tomorrow with the necessary warrants. Preston's eyes held both triumph and concern. Things will move quickly once he arrives. You should be prepared. But events moved more quickly than either of them anticipated. That very night, Vernon Hollister summoned Emmeline to his private office at the back of the saloon. Martin Wade escorted her there, his thin smile more menacing than usual. "Mr. Hollister wishes to discuss your brother's situation," Wade explained as they walked down the narrow hallway. "Seems there might be a change in arrangements." Hollister was seated behind his ornate desk when Emmeline entered, a glass of brandy in his hand and a calculating expression on his face. "Miss Parker," he greeted her, "please sit down. We have matters to discuss." Emmeline remained standing, acutely aware of Wade positioning himself between her and the door. "What matters, Mr. Hollister?" Hollister sighed theatrically. "It saddens me when people I've treated with generosity repay me with deception." He opened a ledger on his desk. "Your brother's debt. A considerable sum, and yet I've been patient, allowed you to work it off gradually, even stopped the interest clock as a gesture of goodwill." His voice hardened. "And how do you repay this kindness?" "By conspiring with Preston Phillips to undermine my business." Emmeline's mouth went dry, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, don't insult my intelligence." Hollister closed the ledger with a snap. "I have eyes and ears throughout this territory. Did you really think your little meetings with Phillips would go unnoticed? That his sudden interest in my financial records wouldn't raise suspicions?" "If your business practices are honest, Mr. Hollister, you have nothing to fear from any investigation," Emmeline replied, summoning her courage. Hollister laughed without humor. "Honest? My dear, this is the frontier. The only law that matters is the law of survival." He stood, moving around the desk toward her. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly what Phillips knows and what he plans to do with that information. Then, you're going to help me convince him that his investigation is misguided. And if I refuse, then I'm afraid your brother's situation in Santa Fe will become significantly more uncomfortable." Hollister's smile was cold. "It's remarkable how easily accidents happen in territorial jails." Fear for Daniel clutched at Emmeline's heart, but she forced herself to think clearly. Preston had said the marshal would arrive tomorrow. They only needed to stall until then. "Very well," she said slowly. "I'll tell you what I know, but not here. I have documentation in my room, papers that Phillips gave me." Hollister exchanged a glance with Wade. "Get them," he instructed Emmeline. "Wade will accompany you." "That won't be necessary," she insisted. "I'll bring everything directly back to you." "I'm afraid I must insist on an escort," Hollister replied smoothly. "As a precaution, I'm sure you understand." Emmeline had no choice but to lead Wade to her small room behind the saloon. Her mind raced as they walked. The derringer Preston had given her was hidden beneath her mattress, but how could she retrieve it with Wade watching? And even if she managed that, what then? She needed a diversion, something to, "Well, isn't this cozy?" Wade remarked as they entered her room, his gaze sweeping over the sparse furnishings and lingering on the narrow bed. "You know, Emmeline, things don't have to be difficult between us. I've always thought you and I could come to a private arrangement." He moved closer, blocking her path to the door. "One that might make your problems with Hollister disappear." Disgust rose in Emmeline's throat, but she forced herself to appear considering. "What sort of arrangement?" Wade's thin lips curved into a smirk. "The kind where you're nice to me and I'm nice to Hollister on your behalf." His hand reached out to touch her cheek. "Very nice." Emmeline allowed him to step closer, then suddenly clutched her stomach, doubling over with a convincing groan of pain. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I need, please, could you get me some water?" Momentarily startled, Wade glanced toward the empty washstand pitcher. "There's no water here. Please," Emmeline pleaded, sinking to her knees beside the bed. "I'll be fine in a moment, I just need." With a curse of impatience, Wade moved toward the door. "Don't try anything foolish. I'll be right back." The instant he left, Emmeline lunged for the mattress, thrusting her hand beneath it to retrieve the derringer. She had just secured the weapon in the folds of her dress when Wade returned, pitcher in hand. "Here," he said brusquely, setting it down. "Now, where are these supposed documents?" "In my trunk," Emmeline improvised, moving toward the small chest at the foot of her bed. She knelt before it, using her body to shield her movements as she positioned the derringer in her hand. "Just give me a moment to find them." Wade's patience quickly wore thin. "Hurry up, girl. Hollister's waiting and I'm not in the mood for games." "Almost found them," Emmeline murmured, tensing as she heard him step closer. "That's enough stalling," Wade growled, grabbing her shoulder roughly. "Either produce these papers now," or Emmeline spun around, the derringer leveled at his chest. "Step back," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Wade froze, surprise flashing across his face before it settled into a sneer. "You won't use that," he scoffed. "You haven't got the nerve." "Perhaps not," came a new voice from the doorway, "but I assure you I do." Preston Phillips stood there, his Colt revolver aimed squarely at Wade. "Step away from her, now." Wade's eyes darted between them, calculating his odds. "This is a private matter, Phillips. Nothing to do with you." "I'm making it my business," Preston replied coolly. "Now move away from Miss Parker before I decide this territory would be better off without you." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Wade slowly raised his hands and took 2 steps back. "Hollister will hear about this," he warned. "I'm counting on it," Preston said. "In fact, why don't we go have a word with him together?" "Emmeline, stay behind me." With Wade at gunpoint, they made their way back through the saloon toward Hollister's office. The evening crowd parted before them, conversations dying as people sensed the tension crackling in the air. Rosalie appeared at Emmeline's side, her normally composed face tight with concern. "What's happening?" she whispered. "The truth is coming to light," Emmeline replied simply. "Hollister was pouring himself another brandy when they entered his office." He looked up, momentary surprise giving way to calculated calm when he saw Preston's revolver. "Mr. Phillips," he greeted, setting down his glass. "This seems rather dramatic. Surely whatever misunderstanding has arisen could be resolved over a civilized conversation." "I think we're well past misunderstandings, Hollister," Preston replied. "I know about the fraudulent debts. I know about the threats against Daniel Parker and others. And by this time tomorrow, so will Marshal Carter and the territorial governor." Hollister's facade cracked slightly. "Accusations require proof, Phillips, proof that would stand up in a court of law." "Such as your own ledgers," Preston suggested. "The ones showing how you magically doubled the amount of Daniel Parker's gambling losses. Or perhaps the sworn statements I've collected from 5 other men who discovered their debts mysteriously increased after initial agreements were made." The color drained from Hollister's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Preston's expression remained impassive. "The marshal will be here on the morning train with warrants for your arrest. Banking fraud is a federal offense, Hollister. The kind that sends men to territorial prison for many years." For a long moment, silence filled the office as Hollister visibly calculated his options. Then, with startling suddenness, he lunged for the drawer of his desk. "Gun!" Wade shouted. Preston reacted instantly, shoving Emmeline to the floor as a shot cracked through the air. The bullet splintered the doorframe where they had been standing. Before Hollister could fire again, Preston had steadied his aim and returned fire. The banker cried out, clutching his shoulder as blood bloomed across his expensive suit coat. In the chaos, Wade made a grab for Preston's gun. The two men grappled, crashing against the desk as they fought for control of the weapon. Emmeline, still clutching her derringer, scrambled to her feet, but hesitated, afraid of hitting the wrong man if she fired. The struggle ended abruptly when the office door burst open and Big Tom entered, shotgun in hand. "That's enough," his booming voice commanded. "Next man who moves gets a belly full of buckshot." Wade slowly released Preston and stepped back, hands raised. Hollister remained behind his desk, one hand pressed to his wounded shoulder, hatred burning in his eyes. "Well, isn't this a fine mess?" drawled a new voice. Marshal Jenkins stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. "Someone want to tell me what in blazes is going on here?" By the time the real story had been sorted out, dawn was breaking over Los Alamos. Marshal Jenkins had Hollister and Wade locked in the town jail, with deputies posted outside in case any of Hollister's other associates got ideas about a rescue. The saloon had been closed, its patrons sent home, and Rosalie was serving coffee to Emmeline and Preston in the now quiet main room. "Marshal Carter will be here on the 9 o'clock train," Preston explained, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "He'll take Hollister and the evidence back to Santa Fe. There's more than enough to convict him of fraud, extortion, and likely several other charges once people start coming forward." "And my brother?" Emmeline asked, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup to hide their trembling. "Carter's bringing him with him," Preston assured her. "I telegraphed as soon as we had Hollister in custody. Daniel should be a free man by noon." Relief washed through Emmeline, bringing tears to her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. Preston's hand covered hers on the table. "No thanks necessary." Hollister had been operating unchecked for too long. Someone needed to stand up to him. "Few would have taken the risk," Emmeline pointed out. "Especially not for strangers." A faint flush colored Preston's weathered cheeks. "Perhaps you're not quite as much a stranger as all that," he admitted. "I've grown rather invested in your welfare these past weeks." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, a current of understanding and possibility that made Emmeline's heart quicken. The moment was interrupted when Rosalie returned with fresh coffee. "So, what happens to the horseshoe now?" she asked practically. "With Hollister gone, who owns it?" "The bank, most likely," Preston replied. "Though once the fraud investigation is complete, ownership may be complicated. There will be claims against his assets from everyone he cheated." "Including us," Emmeline realized. "The money I've been paying toward Daniel's debt, we should get that back, shouldn't we?" "And then some," Preston confirmed. "The territorial court is likely to order full restitution to all of Hollister's victims. It may take time, but yes, you should recover everything." Emmeline sat back, trying to absorb the implications. After months of seeing no way out, of watching her future narrow to an endless tunnel of servitude in the saloon, suddenly possibilities were opening before her again. The ranch could be saved. Daniel would be free. She could reclaim her life. And yet, she realized with a start, the life she had known before seemed strangely distant now, like a story she'd once heard rather than her own experience. So much had changed. She had changed during these months at the horseshoe. "What will you do now?" Preston asked gently, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm not entirely sure," Emmeline admitted. "Return to the ranch, certainly. Try to rebuild what we've lost." She hesitated. "And you? Will you continue your expansion plans now that Hollister's properties may be tied up in legal disputes?" "Some aspects of my plans may need reconsideration," Preston acknowledged, but others. His eyes held hers. Other aspects have become even more appealing. Before Emmeline could respond, the door opened and Marshal Jenkins returned. "Phillips," he called, "telegraph for you from Santa Fe." Preston excused himself to read the message, returning moments later with evident relief. "Carter confirms he's on the morning train with Daniel," he reported. "And he's bringing additional deputies to help secure Hollister's records and assets." The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Other territorial officials began arriving in Los Alamos as word of Hollister's arrest spread. The bank was temporarily closed pending investigation. The Gilded Horseshoe remained shut, its future uncertain, while Rosalie efficiently organized the other Saloon girls to collect their belongings and make alternative arrangements. Emmeline returned to her small room one last time, packing her few possessions into the same valise she had brought months earlier. The blue satin dress hung in the wardrobe, a reminder of a role she would never have to play again. After a moment's consideration, she left it there. Some memories were better not carried forward. Preston was waiting for her outside. "The train from Santa Fe should be arriving soon," he said. "Shall we go meet it?" They walked together toward the station, their pace unhurried despite the anticipation of Daniel's arrival. Los Alamos seemed different in the bright morning sunlight, the same buildings and streets, but somehow cleaner, more full of promise. "I've been thinking about your ranch," Preston said as they passed the shuttered bank. "You mentioned it needs rebuilding." "Yes," Emmeline sighed. "The drought hit us hard last year, and without proper management while I've been away, I'm sure things have deteriorated further." "I meant what I said before about a potential partnership," Preston continued. "Not just as a business proposition, though. I'd like to help, Emmeline. If you'll let me." She glanced at him, noting the earnestness in his expression. "Why is this so important to you?" Preston was silent for several steps, seeming to gather his thoughts. "6 years ago, I lost my wife and young son to typhoid fever," he finally said, his voice low. "For a long time afterward, I focused solely on building my cattle operation, working myself to exhaustion each day so I wouldn't have to think, wouldn't have to feel. It became my only purpose." "I'm so sorry," Emmeline said softly, her heart aching for his loss. "Coming to New Mexico was meant to be just another business expansion," he continued. "But then I met you, and I saw someone fighting with such dignity and courage against impossible odds. It woke something in me, made me remember there are more important things than business success." They had reached the station platform, where a small crowd was already gathering in anticipation of the train's arrival. Preston turned to face Emmeline directly. "What I'm trying to say, rather badly, is that helping you isn't charity or business. It's because I care what happens to you, Emmeline. More than I expected to care about anyone again." The distant whistle of the approaching train punctuated his words. Emmeline looked into his earnest blue eyes and saw the truth there, along with a question he wasn't quite asking yet. "I think," she said carefully, "that the Parker Ranch could benefit greatly from the expertise of an experienced cattleman. As for the rest," she smiled softly, "I believe some things are worth taking time to cultivate properly." Relief and hope brightened Preston's face. "I'm a patient man," he assured her, "and thoroughly committed to proper cultivation." The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and billowing steam. Passengers began disembarking, first the usual assortment of businessmen and families, then a group of official-looking men whom Emmeline assumed were the additional deputies. And finally, escorted by a tall man wearing a marshal's badge, came Daniel. Her brother looked thinner than she remembered, his boyish face more angular, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of hard lessons learned. But when he spotted Emmeline, his face lit up with the same irrepressible smile she'd known all his life. "Emmy," he called, rushing toward her. Emmeline met him halfway, throwing her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "Daniel," she breathed, tears threatening, "you're really here." "Thanks to you," he said, pulling back to look at her, "and your friend." He nodded toward Preston, who had respectfully remained a few steps behind. "Preston Phillips," Preston introduced himself, extending a hand to Daniel. "Glad to finally meet you, young man. Your sister has worked very hard to secure your freedom." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "Marshal Carter told me what happened, how you exposed Hollister's fraud and got me released." His expression grew serious. "I don't know how to thank you, sir. You can thank me by learning from this experience," Preston replied, not unkindly, "and by helping your sister restore your family's ranch to prosperity." "I will," Daniel promised, a new maturity in his voice. "I swear it." Marshal Carter joined them, officially releasing Daniel into Emmeline's custody. "Hollister and Wade will be transported to Santa Fe tomorrow for formal charging," he informed them. "We'll need statements from both of you before then." "Of course," Preston agreed. "And what about restitution for Hollister's victims?" "The court will sort that out in due time," Carter replied. "But based on the evidence we've already reviewed, I'd say the Parkers have a strong claim for full recovery of any payments made, plus damages." It was nearly dusk by the time all the necessary statements had been given and paperwork completed. Daniel, exhausted from his journey and the emotional day, had gone to rest at the hotel where Preston had secured rooms for all of them. Emmeline stood on the hotel's small balcony, watching the sunset paint the western sky in bands of orange and purple. The events of the past 24 hours still seemed somewhat unreal. Hollister's arrest, Daniel's return, the sudden unraveling of the nightmare that had consumed her life for months. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Preston stood there, hat in hand, his expression tentative. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "I wanted to check that you have everything you need." "Yes, thank you," Emmeline replied, gesturing for him to enter. "It feels strange to be staying in a proper hotel room after so long in that little cell behind the saloon." "I imagine many things will feel strange for a while," Preston observed, remaining near the door. "Transitions take time, even good ones." "Indeed." Emmeline smiled slightly. "This morning I was a saloon girl with an insurmountable debt. Tonight I'm a free woman with a future again. It's overwhelming." "You were never just a saloon girl, Emmeline," Preston said firmly. "You were always the brave, principled woman who sacrificed her own comfort and reputation to save her brother and their home. The circumstances may have changed, but you haven't." His words warmed her. "Thank you for seeing that," she said softly. "So few did." "I saw it the first night I walked into the Horseshoe," Preston admitted. "There was a light about you, a dignity that the setting couldn't diminish." He cleared his throat, suddenly seeming nervous. "Which brings me to something I wanted to ask you." "Yes, tomorrow I plan to ride out to your ranch to assess what needs to be done there. I wondered if you might accompany me, just to talk, to plan. No commitments beyond that." Emmeline considered him this steady, honorable man who had risked his own safety and business interests to help a woman he barely knew. A man who looked at her and saw not her circumstances but her character. A man whose eyes held both respect and something warmer, something full of promise. "I think I'd like that very much," she replied. The next day dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for their ride to the Parker Ranch. Daniel, still recovering his strength, remained in town to finalize some paperwork with Marshal Carter, promising to join them the following day. Preston arrived with 2 saddled horses and a picnic lunch packed by the hotel kitchen. Emmeline wore her own clothes for the first time in months, a practical riding skirt and jacket that felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. They rode at an easy pace, the late summer landscape of New Mexico territory stretching around them in golden hues. Emmeline found herself pointing out landmarks with increasing animation as they neared her family's land, the mesa where her father had taught her to shoot, the creek where she and Daniel had fished as children, the distant mountains that had been her constant companions. When they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Emmeline reined in her horse, emotion catching in her throat. The modest house with its wooden porch, the small barn and corral, the vegetable garden now overgrown with weeds, it was all exactly as she remembered, yet somehow both more precious and more fragile than before. "Home," she whispered. Preston pulled his mount alongside hers. "It's a good piece of land," he observed, his experienced eye taking in the natural advantages of the property. "Good water source, decent grazing, sheltered position. Your father chose well. He always said it was just enough land for a man to work honestly and still have time to watch the sunset," Emmeline remembered, her voice soft with memory. A wise philosophy. Preston smiled. "Shall we go down?" The Wilsons had maintained the house as best they could, but 6 months of minimal attention had taken its toll. The garden was a tangle of produce and weeds, the corral fence needed mending, and inside, a fine layer of dust covered the simple furnishings. Yet as Emmeline moved through the familiar rooms, running her fingers over her mother's rocking chair and her father's bookshelf, a profound sense of rightness settled over her. This was where she belonged. This was what she had fought to preserve. Preston followed respectfully, offering observations about needed repairs, but mostly letting her reconnect with the space on her own terms. When she finally turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and determination, he simply nodded in understanding. "We'll make it right again," he promised. "All of it." They ate their picnic lunch on the porch, discussing practical matters: how many cattle would be needed to rebuild the herd, which repairs were most urgent, what crops might be planted for the coming seasons. Preston's suggestions were knowledgeable but never presumptuous, offered as possibilities rather than directives. "I have connections with several reputable cattle brokers," he explained. "We could start with a small breeding herd of good quality stock, then expand gradually as the operation becomes self-sustaining." Emmeline queried, raising an eyebrow. Preston colored slightly. "A figure of speech," he said quickly. "It's your ranch, Emmeline. I'm merely offering advice." She studied him thoughtfully. "And if I wanted more than advice, if I were interested in a genuine partnership, then I would be honored," he replied, his voice growing serious. "But I want to be clear, my help comes with no strings attached. My interest in you isn't dependent on business arrangements." "Your interest in me," Emmeline echoed, her heart quickening. Now it was Preston's turn to look flustered. That is to say, I admire you greatly, Emmeline, your courage, your principles, your determination. And I find myself hoping that, in time, you might come to regard me with similar esteem." It was perhaps the most awkward declaration of interest Emmeline had ever heard, yet infinitely more precious than all the practiced compliments she'd received at the Horseshoe. This was a good man, an honest man, laying his hopes before her without presumption or pressure. "I already hold you in the highest esteem, Preston," she said softly. "You saved us when you had no obligation to do so. How could I not?" Relief and something warmer flickered in his eyes. "Then perhaps, when things are more settled, when the ranch is running again and you're secure in your home, perhaps then we might explore what else might develop between us." Emmeline smiled, feeling a lightness she had not experienced in far too long. I think that sounds like a most excellent plan, Mr. Phillips. The weeks that followed were filled with activity and renewal. Daniel threw himself into the ranch work with the fervor of a young man determined to redeem himself, while Emmeline oversaw the restoration of the house and garden. Preston divided his time between his own expanding business interests and advising the Parkers on rebuilding their cattle operation. A territorial judge ruled that all of Hollister's victims were to receive full restitution plus interest, though the process of liquidating his assets and distributing the funds would take time. In the interim, Preston provided the Parkers with a small loan and investment. He insisted to purchase essential supplies and livestock. News came that Vernon Hollister had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and would spend at least 10 years in the territorial prison. Martin Wade had turned state's evidence against his former employer in exchange for a reduced sentence. The Gilded Horseshoe had been sold at auction to new owners who planned to reopen it as a respectable hotel and dining establishment. As autumn painted the landscape in russet and gold, the Parker Ranch began to thrive once more. A small herd of quality cattle grazed in the pastures, the garden yielded a bountiful harvest, and the house rang with conversation and occasionally even laughter. Preston's visits became a regular part of their routine. Sometimes he brought business matters to discuss cattle prices, breeding strategies, potential markets for their beef, but increasingly, he came simply for the pleasure of Emmeline's company. They rode together exploring the boundaries of the ranch, shared meals on the porch watching the sunset, and gradually, cautiously, began to build something neither had expected to find. It was during one such sunset, nearly 3 months after Hollister's arrest, that Preston finally spoke the words that had been building between them. "I've come to realize something, Emmeline," he said as they sat side by side in rocking chairs her father had made years ago. "For a long time after I lost my family, I convinced myself that focusing solely on business was enough, that success and expansion could fill the emptiness. I was wrong." Emmeline watched him quietly, sensing he needed to say these things in his own way, in his own time. "When I came to Los Alamos, I thought I was just adding another property to my holdings," Preston continued, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Instead, I found something I'd forgotten existed, the possibility of connection, of purpose beyond mere accumulation." He turned to look at her directly. "I found you, and I found you," Emmeline replied softly, "when I had lost hope of ever reclaiming my life." Preston reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand in his. "I'm not a poetic man, Emmeline. I can't offer pretty words or grand gestures, but I can promise you honesty, respect, and a heart that has somehow found its way back to life because of you." His voice grew husky with emotion. "I love you. And if you could consider a future with me, not just as business partners, but as husband and wife, I would count myself the most fortunate of men." Tears welled in Emmeline's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so unexpected and complete that it nearly overwhelmed her. This man who had seen her at her lowest point and recognized her true worth, who had fought for her freedom without demanding anything in return, who had gradually and honorably courted her as she healed and rebuilt her life, how could her answer be anything but yes? "I would be honored to build a future with you, Preston," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I love you too, your integrity, your kindness, your quiet strength. Yes, I will marry you." Preston's face transformed with a joy that made him look years younger. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a reverent kiss to her knuckles before standing and pulling her gently to her feet and into his embrace. Their first kiss was tender, a promise sealed beneath the vast New Mexico sky as the first stars began to appear above them. In that moment, Emmeline knew with absolute certainty that all the trials she had endured, the loss of her parents, Daniel's troubles, the months of servitude at the Gilded Horseshoe had led her not to ruin but to this: a love built on respect and shared values, and a future brighter than she could have imagined. The wedding took place that December, a simple ceremony in the newly built church in Los Alamos. Daniel stood proudly as his sister's witness, while Preston's foreman and closest friend served as his. The Wilsons, Rosalie, and even Pearl and Sadie from the former Saloon attended, along with ranchers and townspeople who had known the Parker family for years. Emmeline wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered and adorned with the cameo brooch that had been her constant companion through dark times. Preston, in a new suit that he clearly found somewhat constraining after his usual practical attire, couldn't take his eyes off his bride as they spoke their vows. "I promise to honor and cherish you all the days of my life," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the small church. "To stand beside you in prosperity and hardship alike, to build with you a home founded on love and respect. I promise to be your faithful partner in all life's endeavors," Emmeline responded, her heart full to overflowing. "To support your dreams as you have supported mine, to face whatever comes with courage and honesty, and to love you with constancy and joy." They established their home at the Parker Ranch, which gradually expanded as Preston's business acumen and Emmeline's practical knowledge combined to create one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. Daniel, growing into a responsible young man under Preston's mentorship, eventually took over management of Preston's Wyoming properties, proving himself worthy of the trust placed in him. The following spring brought the birth of their first child, a son they named James, after Preston's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, named Elizabeth after Emmeline's mother. As their family grew, so did their contentment and the prosperity of their ranch. Sometimes in quiet moments, Emmeline would think back to that desperate day when she had received Daniel's telegram about his debt to Vernon Hollister. What had seemed like the end of her world had become, through hardship and unexpected grace, the beginning of a life richer than she could have imagined. And sometimes, when Preston caught her in such reflective moments, he would simply take her hand and say, "No regrets, my love. Every step of the journey brought us here," to which Emmeline would always reply, her eyes shining with happiness, "And here is exactly where we're meant to be." 10 years later, the Phillips Ranch had become one of the most respected cattle operations in the New Mexico territory. Preston and Emmeline's partnership had proven as successful in business as it had in marriage, combining his financial acumen with her intimate knowledge of the land and its rhythms. Their family had grown to include 4 children, James and Elizabeth, now joined by another son, Thomas, and the youngest, Catherine, who at 3 years old was the image of her mother with her father's determined nature. Daniel, now married to the schoolteacher's daughter and managing his own successful ranch nearby, often joked that his reckless gambling debt had turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to the Parker family. Emmeline would smile at this, but both she and Preston knew that the journey from that dark time to their present happiness had been neither easy nor guaranteed. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Preston surprised Emmeline with a special gift, the deed to the old Gilded Horseshoe building, which had changed hands several times over the years and recently fallen into disrepair. "What on earth do you plan to do with that place?" Emmeline asked, bewildered as she examined the document. Preston smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. I thought we might turn it into something else entirely, a school perhaps, or a proper women's boarding house. Something that would give other young women options besides the kind of work you were forced into." Tears welled in Emmeline's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. A place where women could learn trades, perhaps, skills that would allow them to support themselves independently. "Exactly," Preston agreed warmly. "The Emmeline Phillips Institute for Women's Education and Advancement. What do you think?" What Emmeline thought, as she rose on tiptoes to kiss her husband soundly, was that she was truly the most fortunate of women to have found in the aftermath of desperation not just survival, but a partner who understood her heart so completely. And as they stood together on their porch that evening, watching their children play in the yard while the setting sun painted the New Mexico sky in glorious color, Emmeline reflected that sometimes the most difficult journeys led to the most beautiful destinations if one had the courage to keep moving forward, and the wisdom to recognize true worth when it appeared in unexpected places. The account had indeed been settled, but what had grown in its place was beyond any price or measure, a life built on love, respect, and the shared conviction that every day together was its own precious gift.